If you remember camera stores from the film era, you probably remember seeing Vivitar lenses sitting quietly beside the bigger names. They were not always the glamorous choice, but some of them were hiding something special: serious Japanese manufacturing, strong build quality, and a look that modern lenses rarely try to recreate. These three Vivitar lenses prove that budget glass was not always boring, and number one may be the one photographers still remember most. You are watching AltBuzz Lenses. Subscribe for lens stories, forgotten glass, and the classics photographers still talk about. At number 3, we have the Vivitar Series One 28 to 90mm f2.8 to 3.5. There is a version of film-era photography that does not get discussed enough. Not the Leica photographers. Not the Nikon professionals with 2 bodies and a full kit. The version where a working photographer, or an enthusiastic amateur, put one lens on their camera and kept it there for a year. One lens for travel. One lens for family gatherings. One lens for street corners and weekend afternoons and everything in between. That is the version of photography the Vivitar Series One 28 to 90mm was built for. The focal range alone tells you what this lens was designed to do. 28mm on the wide end gives you enough room to work in tight spaces, to catch architecture, to frame a group of people in a small room. 90mm on the long end brings you close enough for portraits, for isolating a subject, for compressing a little distance into something that feels intimate. And the aperture, while not constant, was more than competitive for a third-party zoom of its era. What photographers remember about this lens is not a specific image, it is a feeling, the weight of it. The way the zoom ring turned with some resistance, like it meant it. Metal construction at a time when plastic was starting to creep into the industry. A lens that felt like it deserved to be on your camera, even if it cost significantly less than what Nikon or Canon would have charged you for something in the same range. The Series One 28 to 90mm was not chasing perfection. It was chasing usefulness, and it found it. Sharpness through the middle of the range was solid. Color rendering had that slightly warm, slightly analog quality that film photographers of the era would have recognized immediately. The kind of rendering that modern clinical lenses train themselves away from. For photographers who adapted this lens onto mirrorless bodies in later years, the experience was often similar to what their parents or older colleagues might have described. Dependable, characterful, and honest. Not trying to be invisible. Not trying to disappear into technical precision. Just trying to be a good lens. Vivitar built a lot of lenses that were simply useful. That is not a criticism. At a time when first-party glass could put serious photography out of reach for many people, a zoom like the 28 to 90mm Series One gave photographers a real option. One lens, metal construction, solid range, and a rendering that aged better than it probably had any right to. But Vivitar was not only making practical zooms. The next lens is a one that helped make the Series One name feel serious. At number 2, we have the Vivitar Series 170 to 210mm f3.5. If there is one Vivitar lens that changed how photographers thought about the brand, this is probably it. The 70 to 210mm f3.5 did not arrive quietly. It arrived heavy, confident, and at a constant aperture, which, for a third-party zoom in the late 1970s and early 80s, was not a given. A constant f3.5 throughout a zoom range of that length told photographers something. This lens was not cutting corners where it mattered. Third-party telephoto zooms had a reputation problem during this era. If you could not afford a Nikon telephoto, you were expected to accept some kind of compromise in build quality, in optical performance, in the way the lens behaved in your hands. The Vivitar Series 170 to 210mm pushed back against that expectation. The build was substantial. The barrel had real weight to it, the kind of weight that made you feel like the optics inside were worth protecting. The zoom action was smooth. The focus ring turned with the kind of deliberate resistance that photographers who trained on manual glass learned to trust. This was not a lens that felt temporary. Optically, the 70 to 210mm was designed for reach. Sports, wildlife, portraits from a distance, the kinds of photography where the gap between what you could afford and what professional photographers were using felt most visible. This lens helped close that gap in a way that felt meaningful rather than merely acceptable. Part of what made this lens respected was its connection to Japanese manufacturing. Many copies of the 70 to 210mm Series One were produced by Tokina, a factory that also built glass for first-party brands and understood what serious optical manufacturing meant. That context mattered to photographers who knew it, and it matters now for collectors and adapters who track which factory made which version of which lens. Photographers who mounted this lens on film cameras in the 1980s were not buying a compromise. They were buying a telephoto that could hold its own on a real assignment, and for many of them, it did exactly that. When vintage lens users adapt the 70 to 210mm f3.5 today, they often describe the same quality. A lens that renders with warmth, with some character in the out-of-focus areas, and with a kind of analog softness in the rendering that modern telephoto glass has almost entirely eliminated. Not soft in the sense of unsharp, soft in the sense of human, a rendering that remembers film. If you enjoy lens stories that go beyond specs and explain why photographers still remember old glass, subscribe to Alt Buzz Lenses. This channel is about the lenses, brands, and forgotten systems that still matter today. And at number 1 is the Vivitar lens that still feels less like a bargain bin discovery and more like a quiet cult classic. At number 1, we have the Vivitar Series 190mm f2.5 macro. Some lenses age into their reputation gradually. Photographers use them, recommend them quietly to other photographers, pass them along, and eventually the lens builds a kind of mythology that has very little to do with marketing and everything to do with what it actually produces. The Vivitar Series 190mm f2.5 macro is one of those lenses. It did not have the loudest launch. It was not the lens on the cover of the camera catalogs. But somewhere in the overlap between macro photography, portrait work, and film-era storytelling, it found its audience, and that audience never really let go of it. The lens does two things very well, and the combination is rarer than it sounds as. As a macro, it offers genuine close focus capability, the kind that lets you fill a frame with the texture of a leaf or the face of a flower without fighting the lens. At true 1:2 magnification, the optical performance held up, and for a third-party macro of its era, that was not guaranteed. But the reason photographers still talk about the 90mm f2.5 is not only the macro ability. It is the portrait rendering. At f2.5, the lens separates subjects from backgrounds with a quality that feels deliberate rather than clinical. The bokeh has a character to it, slightly swirly in certain conditions, smooth in others, and always with that analog warmth that came from glass designed before digital workflows, changed what photographers expected from out-of-focus areas. This is not a lens that tries to erase itself. It has a voice, and that voice suited the film era it was built in. The manufacturing story behind this lens adds another layer. Many copies were built by Canon, a Japanese optical manufacturer whose lenses carried real pedigree. Canon-built glass consistently showed up in best of discussions during the film era, and the 90mm macro was one of their more accomplished designs. For photographers who trace the manufacturing chain, this was not really a Vivitar lens in the way a generic zoom was a Vivitar lens. It was Canon glass wearing the Series One badge, and Canon glass deserved to be taken seriously. Today, the Vivitar Series 190mm f2.5 macro has become one of the more sought-after pieces of affordable vintage glass in the manual focus lens community. Photographers adapting it to Sony, Fujifilm, and Nikon mirrorless bodies consistently describe the same experience. A lens that renders differently from what they expected in the best possible way. Sharper than it looks, more characterful than it has any right to be. A macro that doubles as a portrait lens that doubles as a reminder that the film era produced some genuinely special optics under names that history has not been particularly kind to. This is the Vivitar lens that proves the brand once made glass with real soul. Vivitar did not disappear from memory because the lenses were bad. It faded because the name changed meaning. The brand moved away from serious optics. The manufacturing relationships dissolved. The Series One name lost the story that made it matter. And eventually, Vivitar became something else, something easier to overlook, easier to dismiss, easier to walk past in a shop without stopping. But these three lenses are still here. They still turn up in camera bags, in vintage markets, and adapter rings on mirrorless bodies. And when photographers use them, something about the experience reminds them that there was a time when an affordable third-party lens could feel solid, honest, and genuinely worth remembering. For a certain generation of photographers, Vivitar was the brand that made serious glass feel reachable. These lenses carry that memory. They are not perfect, and nobody ever claimed they were. But they had weight, they had character. And in an era when the distance between what you could afford and what professionals were using felt enormous, they helped close that distance in a way that mattered. That is worth remembering. If you enjoy stories about classic lenses, forgotten brands, and the glass photographers still remember, subscribe to AltBuzz Lenses. There is more to come.